Reversing his position, Catholic presidential candidate Joe Biden flips on providing federal money for abortions, what he's now saying about the Hyde Amendment. Pro-life action. The U.S. bishops react to a Trump administration decision to discontinue research using fetal tissue from abortions. Near collision. A close call in the East China Sea between an American and Russian warships. And the news in Latin. The Vatican launches a new broadcast using the language of ancient Rome. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, June 7th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Former Vice President Joe Biden reverses course on the pro-life Hyde Amendment. It bans federal money from being used to pay for most abortions. The Catholic presidential candidate once supported it, but now opposes it. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi brings us the latest. Jason?
Wyatt, Joe Biden has a mixed record when it comes to abortion. He once criticized Roe v. Wade, and then he supported it. As a senator, he twice voted to pass the partial birth abortion ban. And up to very recently, he said no taxpayer funds should go to cover abortion. But now he's facing a crowded Democratic primary vying for the liberal vote, so the former vice president changes course.
I make no apologies for my last position, and I make no apologies for what I'm about to say.
The Catholic candidate retreats after his rivals blast him.
The vice president is absolutely wrong on this one.
For decades, Biden supported the Hyde Amendment, which bans taxpayer funds from being used in most abortions. Liberals say it's got to go. There's no political or ideological excuse for Joe Biden's support for the Hyde Amendment, which translates into discrimination against poor women and women of color, plain and simple. And now the Democratic candidate reverses himself.
If I believe health care is a right, as I do, I can no longer support an amendment that makes that right dependent on someone's zip code.
Biden is now in sync with the 2016 Democratic platform, which called for the end of Hyde. It's been a long evolution for the lawmaker. In 1974, Biden told the Washingtonian, "I don't like the Supreme Court decision on abortion. I think it went too far. I don't think that a woman has the sole right to say what should happen to her body." He even has a pro-life part of a law named after him. The Biden Amendment stops U.S. aid from going to research related to abortion or involuntary sterilization. Now,
we now see so many Republican governors denying health care to millions of the most poorest and most vulnerable Americans by refusing even Medicaid expansion. I can't justify leaving millions of women without access to the care they need and the ability to exercise their constitutionally protected right.
The Hyde Amendment is added every single year to spending bills. The Biden Amendment is a permanent part of U.S. law. A 2016 poll found 58% of American voters supported the Hyde Amendment, that is banning taxpayer funds from going to most abortions. Now, pro-life groups credit the Hyde Amendment with saving the lives of 2 million babies. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. We will have analysis on the Joe Biden reversal coming up a little bit later in tonight's broadcast. Efforts to repeal Missouri's new heartbeat bill have hit a roadblock. Missouri's Secretary of State says a public vote to veto the pro-life measure is not allowed because the proposal was declared an emergency.
We have to follow with the courts. We are a nation and a state of laws and not of men. If I make people unhappy because I do what the law says, that's what's going to happen.
Republican Jay Ashcroft says the state constitution won't allow him to have a public referendum on the bill. Governor Mike Parson signed the heartbeat bill into law last month. The ACLU has filed a lawsuit seeking to force a public vote to try and block the measure. Tonight, we're hearing more reaction after the Trump administration decided to end some government funding fetal tissue research. Pro-life groups say the experiments rely on aborted babies and have not provided any medical breakthroughs. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Critics of this Trump administration decision say fetal tissue research is vital to create vaccines and has led to life-saving treatment. But besides the ethical concerns, pro-life groups and some healthcare professionals will tell you there's no science to back up those claims. A senior Trump administration official says the decision to stop government scientists from using fetal tissue for research was the president's own call. Pro-life groups applaud the plan, arguing taxpayers shouldn't be funding research that uses aborted baby body parts. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops released a statement saying, scavenging and commodifying the body parts of abortion victims for use in research gravely disrespects the bodies of these innocent human beings. Their remains deserve the same respect as that of any other person. Still, critics have slammed the Trump administration's decision. A senior policy manager with the Guttmacher Institute claims the plan to stop fetal tissue research poses a direct threat to crucial research to find treatments for HIV and other health threats. But Dr. David Prentice, research director for the pro-life Charlotte Lozier Institute, says that's simply false.
The proponents of using aborted fetal tissue are either, when they make those statements, ignorant of the science and the history, or willfully deceptive.
Prentice says the government should not rely on the destruction of human life for research. He says it's bad science, and there are better methods that have provided real results. In December, the director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Francis Collins, said there is strong evidence that scientific benefits come from fetal tissue research, and he said it would continue to be the mainstay for certain types of research. Now, that caused many pro-lifers to call for Dr. Collins' resignation. They are now hopeful he will carry out this new directive from the president. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. President Trump is heading back to Washington after his trip to Europe. He says proposed tariffs on goods from Mexico are still set to take effect Monday, though both countries are negotiating.
As negotiations continued yesterday, we were more encouraged that they came forward with some of the things that we put on the table Wednesday to say they were open to that. But, Kristen, there's a long way to go still. That's the bottom line.
Mark Short, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, was speaking today to reporters. The White House says Mexico can stop the U.S. from implementing the tariffs by helping to stem the tide of immigrants trying to enter the United States illegally. Warships from the United States and Russia nearly collide with each other in the East China Sea. The vessels came within 165 feet of each other. The U.S. Navy says the two ships were so close the USS Chancellorsville on the right was forced to go in reverse and hit the gas. No one was injured. The U.S. and Russia are blaming each other. British Prime Minister Theresa May formally stepped down today as the leader of the UK's Conservative Party. She failed in numerous attempts to guide Britain out of the European Union. May will remain in office as Prime Minister for a few more weeks. Initial voting for her successor begins next week. The new governor of Guam says she's troubled by the U.S. territory's lack of access to abortion. Lou Leon Guerrero voiced her pro-abortion views during her campaign, but there has not been an abortion provider in Guam since May of 2018, and no doctors currently will perform the procedure. Guam is 85% Catholic. An archdiocese in Cuba opens a home to serve senior citizens. It was done in cooperation with the country's public health system. Archbishop Wilfredo Pino Estevez, the head of the Archdiocese of Camagüey, says the initiative shows the communist government and the church can work together. A Vatican foundation is hosting a conference on the Pope's letter on climate change and caring for the environment. The meeting features economists and professors from all around the globe. They're discussing ways to implement Laudato Si in the digital world. Topics include global food security and examining whether finance listens to the needs of the poor. Joining us now is one of the conference speakers. Dr. Mary Hirschfeld is an associate professor of economics and theology at Villanova University. She joins us from Rome. Mary, welcome to the broadcast. Laudato Si was written nearly 4 years ago. What effect has it had so far?
Well, when it comes to a papal encyclical, it takes a while for it to have an impact on the world. It already has attracted quite a bit of attention. There have been many conferences held around it. Volumes have come out commenting on it. So it's off to a good start. But I'm thinking it's going to be one of those encyclicals like Centesimus Annus that really has a long life, that has a long impact. It's calling for a profound change in attitude towards the environment, towards the economy. And I think as that lesson sinks in, it's going to have a real impact on the world.
Well, as I mentioned, you're an economist and a theologian. Is there a connection between Laudato Si and the world economy?
Again, not an immediate one. So he's not talking about how to like when I think as an economist, Laudato Si doesn't really say anything to me that's helpful. But on another level, again, it's really profound. So one of the main messages of Laudato Si is that we need to learn to see the world as a web of thick relationships, and that includes especially among people. So real emphasis on community. Laudato Si refers to our planet as our common home. And the reason why that's important is when we think about world trade or the world economy, we think in terms of numbers and figures, like what were exports, what were imports. And in doing all that, we forget the human behind all those goods and services that we're exporting and importing. So what Laudato Si asks us to do is to remember, like when I'm enjoying a nice sweater that I bought that was imported from Ireland, to think of those people, right? Because they were doing me a service, was part of a common family. So that's just tip of the iceberg. That's not the main thing he's talking about, but it's the sensibility of seeing ourselves, seeing the human first and the economic second.
Let me follow up with you on that, because at Villanova you actually emphasize an approach to economics grounded in the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. So I wanted to ask you more about that. How do you apply his words, Aquinas, to the modern economy? And maybe some of that's the same thing that you're talking about.
It's very similar. What I loved about Laudato Si is it ends up tracking a lot of the work that I do in my own book in a different language. But what Aquinas invites us to remember is that wealth is a real good. It's good that we have prosperity, but it's not an end in itself. So why do I like having money? I like having money because it allows me to support a family or to build a life that reflects God's goodness in whatever way I'm called to reflect it. And the key reason why that's important is in our world, we tend to think, I want money to buy these things, but I want to get as much of it as I can so I can get as many things as I can. And money ends up being the most important thing, even if we think our lives are about something else. So Aquinas just reminds us to step back from the economy and think, what is my life really about? What are the goods that I really want to bring? What are the goods that I really want to manifest in my life, to share with others? And then, given that that's my vision of the goods that I want to have in this life, how much stuff do I need to make that happen? And if I think about it that way, then it's a lot easier for me to look at my salary and go, yeah, that's enough. Dr.
Mary Hirschfeld, Associate Professor of Economics and Theology at Villanova University, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Coming up, analysis on Joe Biden's reversal on the Hyde Amendment and the Pope's prayer intentions for June.
Quiero pedirles que dirijan su mirada a los sacerdotes que trabajan en nuestras comunidades.
Pope Francis releases his prayer intention for June. He's asking the faithful to pray for priests and their way of life. He says the clergy are not perfect, but many work hard to serve the people, and we should be thankful for their example. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Pro-life Democrats say they're disappointed presidential candidate Joe Biden dropped his support of the pro-life Hyde Amendment. As we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, the federal law bans taxpayer funding of abortion unless a pregnancy is a result of a rape or incest or is done to save the life of the mother. The former vice president says he reversed his stance as he was developing his upcoming comprehensive health care proposal. Biden says he can no longer support an amendment that makes it more difficult for some women to, quote, access health care. Joining me now with analysis is Michael New, Associate Scholar at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and he's the visiting Assistant Professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Michael, welcome back to the broadcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
The former vice president says his decision to oppose the Hyde Amendment was not about health care, was about health care, but not about politics. Now, aside from the fact that the church doesn't consider abortion to be health care, I think you and I can agree a lot of this is likely about politics. So how do you think this will impact his candidacy?
Well, I think certainly it's political. And I think, frankly, this probably will help him as he tries to get the Democratic Party's nomination for president. Taking this position will insulate him from criticism from other Democrat candidates who are running for president. But I think it's going to hurt him in the general election. I think clearly, if you look at the polling data, most Americans oppose taxpayer funding of abortion. We had two polls come out during the summer of 2016. Over 55% oppose Medicaid coverage of abortion. And when it's awarded as taxpayer funding for abortion, opposition can go as high as 60%. So I think that this may well help him in the Democratic primaries, but it's certainly a losing issue for him in the general election should he be the Democratic Party's nominee.
When Biden initially expressed his support for the Hyde Amendment, he was constantly criticized, as you mentioned, by the other Democratic candidates. What do you think this signals from the Democratic Party in terms of Democrats who have pro-life views?
I think it kind of indicates there's really not much room for them in the Democratic Party. Right now we have over 20 Democrats running for president, and they're all pretty much saying the same thing on sanctity of life issues. They all support Roe v. Wade. They all oppose the Hyde Amendment. They seem to think that taxpayer dollars should fund elective abortions. So again, if you're a pro-life Democrat and you want to vote in the Democratic presidential primary, you really don't have any good options at this point, so far as I can see.
In your work at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, you've taken a closer look at the Hyde Amendment. So tell me a little bit more about it. What does your study find?
Sure, the Hyde Amendment places kind of limits on the ability of federal taxpayer dollars to fund abortion through the Medicaid program. And it's interesting, when you look at abortion policy, lots of things are debated. But when it comes to taxpayer funding of abortion, there's a lot of consensus. Most researchers, in fact, almost every researcher, whether they're pro-life or pro-choice, agrees you cut taxpayer funding for abortion, abortion numbers go down. Back in 2009, Guttmacher, which up until 2007 was Planned Parenthood's research arm, they did a comprehensive literature review of studies of taxpayer funding for abortion. A vast majority of the economics and public health studies found, again, you cut taxpayer funding for abortion, abortion rates go down. Center for Reproductive Rights did a study in 2010, found the same thing. And my Lozier study in 2016 on the 40th anniversary of the Hyde Amendment found the Hyde Amendment saved over 2 million lives since 1976. So there's really a strong consensus that this Hyde Amendment is a life-saving policy and one that deserves support.
And like I said, we encourage people to read more about the Hyde Amendment because there is so much information that people don't know. Michael New, Associate Scholar at the Charlotte Lozier Institute and Visiting Assistant Professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Thanks for having me.
Cardinal Sgreccia has died in Rome. He was called the father of Italian bioethics, and he was president of Emeritus of the Pontifical Academy for Life. His Eminence published more than 400 books and articles on medical science and ethics. Cardinal Sgreccia died peacefully one day before his 91st birthday. Up next, a new study on the clergy abuse crisis. And we hear from World War II vets as the nation this week commemorates the 75th anniversary of D-Day. On this day 37 years ago, President Ronald Reagan met with Pope John Paul II for the first time at the Vatican. Historians say the two had a special bond and how together they were key to the end of the Cold War. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. A Catholic scholar examines the clergy sex abuse crisis and has some recommendations to both the clergy and the laity for how to move forward. Father Paul Sullins joins me now. He's Senior Research Associate at the Ruth Institute and the author of the new study, Receding Waves, Child Sex Abuse and Homosexual Priests Since 2000. Father Paul, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
In general, what time period did you look at for this study, and what did you find out about the nature and the scope of the abuse?
Yeah, in a former study that came out last October, we looked at the same period of time covered by the John Jay data, which was from 1950 through 2002. In this current study, we pick up where that left off, and we start basically at 2000 and look at it up to the present time. And we find that we call it receding waves because the wave of the increase of homosexual priests that was aligned with the wave of the increase of the abuse of boys has now receded and declined up through the present time.
What did you learn when you look at some of the data, in particular about the age and the gender of the abuse victims?
Yeah, it's all different from what it was in the 1980s. In the 1980s, most of the victims were boys. 4 in 5 were boys. Today, only 1 in 3 victims are boys. Most of the victims are girls. They're older. Most of the victims are above the age of puberty today. In the 1980s, that was the opposite was the case. We also found that most of the abuse today is not by newly ordained priests, also a reversal from the 1980s.
So tell me more about that. What are you finding about the priests in particular?
Well, the younger priests, the more newly ordained priests today, we estimate that there are very few homosexual priests that have been ordained in the last 20 years. According to the estimates and calculations, as best as we can figure them out, we have a kind of a bulge or a cohort of homosexual priests in the older priests. So for priests above the age of 60, about 1 in 5 are homosexual, but for priests under the age of 50, only 1 in 30 are homosexual. And this comes from surveys in which they report their own sexual attractions or orientations. So I'm using that word like they would use that word.
It's interesting to hear how the numbers just change over the years, over the decades, in fact. As you know, the bishops are preparing to meet next week for the Bishops' Conference, and they're talking about bishop accountability. What kind of recommendations would you make to them, church officials, laity in general?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think we always have to remember the pain of the victims and better ways to help them to heal and to restore. But beyond that, I say that the charter it has done much good, and the way, if it can be reaffirmed with this new motu proprio in ways that will help it to be more effective, I think that would be a great thing. The National Review Board just came out with its report last week and reported once again that there was not full compliance. For instance, a fourth of the dioceses have not had refresher safe environment training. Right. They call for parish audits in addition to diocesan audits. So we audit the dioceses and they report, but we don't know how accurate the information is that's reported by the parishes to the dioceses. They also call for complete independence so that they can make maybe more pointed kind of investigations. Those would all be good things.
A lot to consider there, and obviously just one of many reasons why this study and bringing all this information out to light is so important. Father Paul Sullins, Senior Research Associate at the Ruth Institute, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Starting tomorrow, the Vatican is releasing a weekly 5-minute podcast in Latin.
Magister in Inquisizione atque in bioetice educazione.
The project is called Hebdomada Papae, or the Week of the Pope. The project is led by the Vatican's Latin Letters Office, where church documents are written in or translated into Latin. The initiative aims to breathe new life into Latin, the official language of the Catholic Church. This week, America and its allies are honoring the veterans who served in one of the deadliest conflicts of World War II. This year marks the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Today we remember the sacrifices they made for our freedom.
They should never forget what these guys did. It was amazing. It took guys in 8 and 10 weeks to put them in the front lines, and they fought. They were just good guys. You know, they did the job.
Oh, say, can you see?
We met David Sunnig and his fellow veterans at the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. The monument features an inscription dedicated to D-Day.
You know, to endure such a traumatic event in their life at such an early age and to survive and to help see the liberation of Europe, that is absolutely worth celebrating and worth remembering.
Joe Davis speaks for the veterans of foreign wars. He praises the troops who fought for freedom on D-Day and beyond.
That greatest generation, they became the politicians and the scientists and the poets, and you know, they became the captains of industry that allowed America to flourish so much in the second half of the past century.
Well, I think basically what they need to know is to appreciate, you know, the suffering and what they contributed to preserve, you know, the freedoms, you know, in our country.
Color guard, retire the colors.
George Hoganson and George Cridland say their generation is passing away, but others will follow in their footsteps.
They should appreciate and understand the most wonderful nation in the world, and that's the United States of America. A lot of blood's been spilled by brave men to keep it that way, and I know they'll carry the torch. It's not just a one-time thing.
What an amazing example of bravery the greatest generation is. Happy we were able to honor them this week and tonight. And that wraps up our newscast. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.